Every morning, Keanu Reeves followed the same routine. Coffee in hand, car engine humming, passing by the quiet neighborhood on his way to work. And every morning, she was there. A little blonde girl, standing at the bus stop, waving at him with the same bright smile. A small moment, insignificant to most. But to Keanu, it had become part of his day. Until one morning, she wasn't there. The street was empty. The silence felt wrong. Keanu told himself it was nothing. But deep down, he knew better. Because what started as a simple absence would soon unravel into something much darker. And by the time Keanu realized the truth, he would no longer be just a passing stranger in her life. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The streets of Los Angeles were still quiet in the early morning, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink. Keanu Reeves stepped out of his house, coffee in hand, ready to start another day of routine. His life, despite his fame, had always followed a simple rhythm. And part of that rhythm? The little girl at the bus stop. Every morning, as Keanu got into his car and drove toward the studio, he passed the same spot. A little blonde girl, around 8 years old, stood at the school bus stop, her small hands clutching the straps of her Hello Kitty backpack. She had bright eyes, a big smile, and an energy that could light up the entire street. And every single day, without fail, she waved at Keanu. And Keanu? He waved back. Sometimes, just a nod. Sometimes a small grin. Other days, if the traffic light was red, he'd even roll down his window and say, "Good morning, kiddo." And she'd beam, as if he'd just made her day. It was a small thing, a passing moment in an ordinary morning. But Keanu had come to expect it. And, if he was honest, he looked forward to it. But some mornings felt off. There were days when the little girl's smile wasn't as bright, when she seemed lost in thought, clutching the straps of her backpack a little tighter, when her waves were slower, as if something heavy sat on her small shoulders. Keanu noticed, but what could he do? He was just a stranger passing by. Still, the feeling lingered, a quiet tug in the back of his mind. But this morning was different, because as Keanu drove past the bus stop, she wasn't there. For the first time since he could remember, the sidewalk was empty. The street, once full of her energy, now felt strangely hollow. Keanu's hands tightened around the wheel. He didn't know why, but something inside him whispered, "Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." As he continued driving, his chest felt tight. The silence of the street was louder than ever, and no matter how much he tried to brush it off, the thought wouldn't leave him. Where is she? Keanu gripped the steering wheel as he merged onto the road toward the studio. It was just a normal morning. So why did it feel so wrong? The empty bus stop lingered in his mind, an image so simple yet unsettling. For months, that little girl had always been there. Rain or shine, smiling, waving, and now, gone. Keanu tried to shake it off. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she had a doctor's appointment. Maybe she was just running late. But no matter how many excuses he made, the feeling wouldn't leave him. Most people wouldn't have noticed her absence. Most people wouldn't have thought twice about it. But Keanu had spent years paying attention. To people, to energy, to things that others ignored. And right now, his gut was screaming at him. He pressed his foot harder on the gas, shaking his head. "It's none of your business," he told himself. But then, a memory surfaced. Just a few mornings ago, she had looked different. Her smile wasn't as bright. Her fingers had fidgeted with the straps of her backpack. And when Keanu had stopped at the red light and rolled down his window, she had waved, but there was a delay. Like she had been somewhere else in her mind. Like she had wanted to say something. But the light turned green, and Keanu had driven off. Keanu exhaled sharply, making a quick decision. Instead of heading straight to the studio, he took a sharp turn back toward the neighborhood. If anyone knew what happened, it was her neighbor, the old woman who always stood outside her house, sweeping the sidewalk like it was a religious ritual. As Keanu parked his car and stepped out, she immediately looked up. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, Mr. Reeves, didn't expect to see you here." Keanu forced a small smile. "Morning. Just had a question." She set the broom aside. "Of course, dear. What is it?" He hesitated. It felt crazy to ask. He wasn't family. He wasn't involved. But something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. The little girl, the one who waits at the bus stop every morning. The old woman's smile faded. Keanu's stomach tightened. "Did you see her today?" The old woman shook her head. "No, dear. And that's strange, isn't it? She never misses school." Keanu's jaw tensed. "Do you know her parents?" She sighed, crossing her arms. "I see her mother sometimes. Always seems in a rush. Never talks much." A pause. Then, more quietly, "And I've heard yelling." Keanu's fingers curled into fists. That wasn't what he wanted to hear. "Do you think something's wrong?" The old woman gave him a long look. "Do you?" Keanu didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew. Something was wrong, and if he walked away now, he might never know just how bad it was. As Keanu got back into his car, his pulse pounded in his ears. He didn't have a plan, didn't know what he was supposed to do next. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just a normal morning anymore, and something told him. If he didn't act soon, it might be too late. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Keanu Reeves pulled onto the familiar street again. He should have been at the studio, reading lines, preparing for another film. But none of that mattered right now, because something wasn't right. And the weight of that feeling only grew heavier as he drove past the empty bus stop once more. Keanu's gaze shifted toward the little girl's house. The curtains were drawn shut. The lights inside were off. It looked like a house that had been abandoned overnight. He slowed the car, gripping the wheel. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't family. But something inside him told him to stop. To check, to be sure. Stepping out of the car, Keanu approached the door. It was eerily silent. No TV playing. No faint sounds of life. He knocked, firm but polite. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Keanu exhaled sharply and turned to leave. Then, a sound. Software faint. Like a whimper. Or a child's cry. Keanu's entire body tensed. It was coming from inside. Keanu knocked again, harder, his pulse spiking. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. Then, a whisper. So quiet, he almost thought he imagined it. "Help." His breath hitched. It was her. The little girl. She was inside. And she was in trouble. Keanu's mind raced. This wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. This was real. And whatever was happening behind that door, he wasn't leaving without finding out. His whisper was barely audible. "Help!" Keanu's chest tightened. The little girl was inside that house. And something was very wrong. He didn't hesitate. He pounded on the door again, harder this time. "It's me! Are you okay?" No response. Just silence. But Keanu wasn't leaving. Not now. Keanu tried the doorknob. Locked. His jaw clenched. He glanced around. The street was quiet. Too quiet. No neighbors outside. No lights on. He hesitated for only a moment before acting on instinct. Taking a step back, he rammed his shoulder into the door. Once. Twice. On the third try, the lock snapped. The door swung open with a creaking groan. And inside? Darkness. Silence. A house that felt abandoned. Except a small figure in the corner. Keanu's eyes adjusted to the dim light. And then he saw her. The little girl, sitting on the floor, hunched over, trembling. Her Hello Kitty backpack lay beside her, torn at the straps. She was hugging her knees to her chest, her blonde hair messy, her skin too pale. When she looked up, Keanu's heart broke. Her eyes were puffy and red, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. And when she recognized him, she ran straight into his arms. Keanu caught her, kneeling down as she clung to him. Her small body shook violently. She was freezing, too light for her age. Something was very wrong. Hey, it's okay. I'm here." The girl sobbed into his shoulder. Keanu gently pulled back, looking into her tear-filled eyes. "Where's your mom?" The girl's lip quivered. Then, one word, software, barely a whisper. "Gone." Keanu's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was something worse. And if he didn't act fast, he might be the only person left who could save her. The little girl's one whispered word echoed in Keanu's mind. Gone. She was alone. No mother. No one looking out for her. And from the way she shivered in his arms, Keanu knew. She wasn't just scared. She was weak. Too weak. Keanu gently pulled back, his hands on her tiny shoulders. "Kiddo, look at me." Her glassy blue eyes flickered up, unfocused, her lashes still damp with tears. She was burning up. Fever. Her skin was clammy, her breaths short and uneven. She needed help. Now Keanu didn't think twice. He scooped her up, her small arms instinctively wrapping around his neck. She weighed almost nothing. A child her age should have been full of life, full of energy. Instead, she collapsed against him like a rag doll. His heart pounded. Something was very, very wrong. Keanu carried her outside, holding her close, shielding her from the cool evening air. His car was just across the street. With one swift motion, he opened the door and gently placed her in the passenger seat, buckling her in. Her head lulled to the side, her eyelids fluttering. Keanu reached over, his voice urgent but soft. "Hey, stay awake for me, all right?" She gave the weakest nod. Keanu clenched his jaw. His foot slammed the gas pedal. The city lights blurred past as Keanu drove, his grip tight on the wheel. Every few seconds he glanced over at her. Her breaths were shallow. She was barely conscious. Keanu's stomach twisted. He had no idea what had happened to her, but he knew this much. If he had waited even one more day, she might not have survived. Keanu pulled into the emergency entrance, tires screeching. Before the car had even fully stopped, he was out of his seat, pulling open the door. He lifted the little girl into his arms, her limp body pressing against his chest. Doctors and nurses turned. Their eyes widened as they recognized him. But Keanu didn't care about that. He only said one thing. "She needs help. Now!" The doctors rushed forward, taking the little girl from his arms. Keanu watched helplessly as they hurried her inside. And as the hospital doors swung shut in front of him, he was left standing there, breathless. For the first time, he felt it. Not just concern, not just responsibility, but something deeper. Something telling him that his role in this wasn't over. Because if her mother never came back, then what? The hospital hallway felt too bright, too sterile, too quiet. Keanu Reeves sat in the waiting area, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. The little girl had been rushed into the ER, a team of nurses and doctors surrounding her, machines beeping, voices sharp with urgency. And now all he could do was wait. A nurse approached, a clipboard in hand, cautious eyes meeting his. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu stood immediately. "Is she okay?" The nurse hesitated. "She's stable for now," but she was severely dehydrated and malnourished. Keanu's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. She was too small, too fragile. The nurse continued, voice lower. "We also found bruises, old ones, on her arms and back." Keanu's breath hitched. A slow, sinking feeling settled in his chest. This wasn't just neglect. This was something worse. A woman in a dark blazer appeared next, her presence immediately different from the hospital staff. She flashed a social services badge. "Mr. Reeves, my name is Karen Dawson. I need to ask you some questions." Keanu nodded, his voice steady. "Anything you need." Karen glanced at the chart in her hand. "The child. Her name is Emily. We've been trying to locate her mother. No luck so far." Keanu felt his pulse quicken. "No family?" Karen hesitated. "No known relatives. We're looking into the father, but so far, nothing." Keanu ran a hand through his hair. She was alone. Completely alone. Karen watched him carefully. "Mr. Reeves, do you know how she ended up in that house alone?" Keanu inhaled slowly. "Number. But I intend to find out." Keanu left the hospital with a new mission. He needed answers. And he knew exactly where to start. Back in the neighborhood, the old woman who always swept her sidewalk looked up as Keanu approached. This time, she wasn't surprised to see him. She had been expecting him. "You found her, didn't you?" Keanu nodded. "She's in the hospital. She was alone, starving." The old woman's face fell. She set her broom aside and sighed. "I knew something wasn't right." Keanu waited. The woman met his gaze. "Her mother. She had problems. I heard them fighting. A lot." Keanu's fists tightened at his sides. "Did you ever call the police?" The old woman nodded. "Once. But nothing changed. Then, a few days ago, I saw the mother leave. She had a suitcase, and she never came back." Keanu's stomach dropped. Emily had been alone for days. No food, no help. Just waiting. Waiting for a mother who was never going to return. Keanu turned back toward his car, his mind racing. Emily had no one, no parents, no family. And if the system had its way, she'd end up in foster care, bouncing from place to place. Unless... Keanu inhaled deeply. A thought formed. A thought so reckless, so unexpected. But one that he couldn't ignore. Because this wasn't just about saving her once. This was about making sure she was never alone again. Keanu sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the hospital doors. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely unsure of what to do next. Emily had no one. Her mother had walked away. Her father was nowhere to be found. And the system, it would process her, place her in foster care, shuffle her between houses until she became just another lost case. Unless... Keanu clenched his jaw. The thought had been there since the moment he left the hospital. And now, it wouldn't leave. Keanu walked back into the hospital, heading straight for Karen Dawson, the social worker. She looked up, already sensing his determination. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu took a slow breath. "I want to help." Karen nodded. "You already did. If you hadn't found her, she might not have made it." Keanu's voice was calm but firm. "I don't mean just today." Karen's expression shifted. She studied him for a moment, closing the file in front of her. "What exactly are you saying?" Keanu exhaled. Then, finally, he said it. "I want to take care of her." Karen leaned back, assessing him. "Mr. Reeves, do you understand what you're saying?" Keanu didn't blink. "I know she doesn't have anyone. I know the system won't give her what she needs. And I know that He paused, swallowed hard, then softer. "I know that I don't want her to feel alone again." Karen sighed. "Keanu, you're an actor. You travel, you work nonstop. Taking care of a child isn't just about wanting to help. It's about consistency, stability." Keanu nodded. "I know, and I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I'm not going to let her disappear into the system either." Karen was quiet for a long moment. Then, "There's a process for this. If you're serious, we'll need to go through it the right way." Keanu exhaled. Then let's start. Keanu sat at Emily's bedside later that evening. She was awake now, color returning to her cheeks, but still tired. When she saw him, she gave a small smile. "You came back." Keanu nodded. "I told you I would." She clutched her patched-up Hello Kitty backpack. She hesitated, then, barely above a whisper, "What's gonna happen to me?" Keanu's throat tightened. He could have given the official answer. That social services would find a place for her. That they'd make sure she was okay. But that wasn't enough. So instead, he reached for her hand. "You're not alone, kiddo. I'm gonna make sure of that." Her eyes welled with tears. But this time, they weren't from fear. They were from hope. As Keanu left the hospital that night, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a rescue anymore. This was about a promise. And no matter how hard it would be, he wasn't going to break it. The morning sun cast a soft golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. Keanu drove slowly down the familiar street. And there she was, Emily, standing at the bus stop, and she was smiling. Keanu eased his car closer, watching her. She looked so different now. Not just healthier, but lighter, happier. Her cheeks weren't pale anymore. Her thin frame had filled out with strength. And in place of her tattered backpack was a new, bright pink Hello Kitty bag. But what hit Keanu the most? Her eyes. Once filled with fear and uncertainty, they now held something she hadn't had in a long time. Hope. As Keanu drove away, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He had stepped into Emily's world by accident. A routine moment. A simple wave. And yet, it had led to something life-changing. Now, she had a new chance. A safe home. A future.